Hello, and thank you for joining me in AnnyStories. In the next several clips, I will be reading Tales from the Arabian Nights, edited by W.H.D. Rouse. Most of these tales you may have heard of already, or even watched them as Disney cartoons. Come and join me in this clip for Rouse's edited version of The Story of the Fisherman. So, without further ado, let us begin our journey of Arabian tales. The Story of the Fisherman. There was once an aged fisherman who was so poor that he could scarcely earn as much as would maintain himself, his wife, and 3 children. He went every day to fish betimes in the morning, and imposed it as a law upon himself not to cast his nets above 4 times a day. He went out one morning after daybreak, and coming to the seaside, cast in his nets. As he drew them towards the shore, he found them very heavy, and thought he had a good draught of fish, at which he rejoiced. But in the moment after, perceiving that instead of fish, his nets contained nothing but a carcass of a donkey, he was much vexed to have made such a sorry draught. He mended his nets, which were broken in several pieces, and threw them in a second time. When he would have withdrawn them, he found a great deal of resistance, which made him think he had taken abundance of fish, but he found nothing except a basket full of gravel and slime, which grieved him extremely. He threw away the basket, and, washing his nets from the slime, cast them the 3rd time, but brought up nothing except stones, shells, and mud. No language can express his disappointment. He was almost distracted. However, as dawn began to appear, he did not forget to say his prayers like a good Mussulman, and he added to them this petition: "Lord, thou knowest that I cast my nets only 4 times a day. I have already drawn them 3 times. Without the least reward for my labor, I am only to cast them once more. I pray thee to render the sea favorable to me." The fisherman, having finished this prayer, cast his nets the 4th time, and when he thought it was proper, drew them out, as formerly, with great difficulty, but instead of fish, found nothing in them but a vessel of yellow copper, which from its weight seemed not to be empty, and he observed that it was shut up and fastened with lead, having the impression of a seal upon it. This turn of fortune rejoiced him. "I will sell it," said he, "to the founder, and buy a measure of corn with the money." He examined the vessel on all sides, and shook it to try if its contents made any noise, but heard nothing. This circumstance, and the fact that the bottle was sealed with a leaden cover, made him think that it contained something precious. To try this, he took a knife and easily opened the bottle. He turned the mouth downward, but nothing came out, which surprised him extremely. He placed it before him, but while he viewed it attentively, there came out a very thick smoke, which obliged him to retire 2 or 3 paces back. The smoke ascended to the clouds, and, extending itself along the sea and upon the shore, formed a great mist, which we may well imagine filled the fisherman with astonishment. When the smoke was all out of the vessel, it reunited and became a solid body, of which was formed a genie twice as high as the greatest of giants. At the sight of the monster of such an unwieldy bulk, the fisherman would fain have fled, but was so frightened that he could not move. "Solomon!" cried the genie immediately. "Solomon, great prophet, pardon, pardon! I will never oppose your will. I will obey all your commands." The fisherman, when he heard these words, recovered his courage. "Proud spirit," said he, "it is above 1800 years since the prophet Solomon died, and we are now at the end of time. Tell me your history and how you came to be shut up in this vessel." "Presumptuous fellow," said the genie, turning to the fisherman with a fierce look, "speak to me with more respect, I pray you, else I will kill you." "Why would you kill me?" replied the fisherman. "Did I not just now set you at liberty? And have you already forgotten my services?" "That will not save you," the genie answered. "I have only one favor to grant you, and that is the choice of what manner of death you would have me put to you." "But wherein have I offended you?" demanded the fisherman. "Hearken to my story," said the genie, "and you will then understand the case. I am one of those rebellious spirits that oppose the will of Solomon, the great prophet. He therefore sent his servants to take me by force and bring me before him, and as I still persisted in refusing to submit to his authority, he vowed to punish me. He therefore shut me up in this copper vessel, and that I might not break my prison, he himself stamped the leaden cover with his great seal. He then gave the vessel to one of the genies who had submitted to him, with orders to throw me into the sea. During the first 100 years of my imprisonment, I swore that if anyone should deliver me before the expiration of that period, I would make him rich beyond belief. That century ran out, however, and during the second, I made an oath that I would open all the treasures of the earth to anyone that might set me at liberty, but with no better success. In the third, I promised to make my deliverer a powerful monarch, to be always near him in spirit, and to grant him every day 3 requests, no matter what they might be. But this century passed as the 2 former, and I continued in my prison. At last, being angry to find myself a prisoner so long, I swore that if afterwards anyone should deliver me, I would kill him without mercy, and grant him no other favor but to choose the manner of his death. And therefore, since thou hast delivered me today, I give thee that choice." For some time the fisherman reasoned with the genie, and endeavored to dissuade him from his purpose, but seeing that it was useless, he determined to resort to stratagem. "Since I must die then," said he to the genie, "I submit to the will of heaven, but before I choose the manner of my death, I conjure you by the great name of the prophet Solomon to answer me truly the question I am going to ask you." The genie having promised to speak the truth, the fisherman said to him, "I wish to know if you are really in this vessel, for I cannot believe it is capable of holding one of your size." "I swear to you that I was there, notwithstanding," replied the genie, "just as truly as you see me here." "Well," said the fisherman, "I cannot and will not believe you, unless you go into the vessel again to prove it to me." Upon this, the body of the genie began to dissolve, and change itself into smoke, extending as before upon the seashore. At last it began to collect itself and to re-enter the vessel, until no part remained outside, when immediately a voice came forth which said to the fisherman, "Well now, incredulous fellow, do not you believe me now?" The fisherman, instead of answering the genie, took the cover of lead, and having speedily replaced it on the vessel, cried out, "Now it is your turn to beg my favor, and to choose which way I shall put you to death. But rather will I throw you into the sea, whence I took you, and I will build a house upon the shore, where I will reside and give notice to all fishermen who come to throw in their nets, to beware of such a wicked genie, who has made a vow to kill him that shall set you at liberty." The genie struggled hard to set himself at liberty, but finding this impossible, endeavored to persuade the fisherman to let him out of the bottle. "What I said to you was only by way of jest," he said. "O genie," replied the fisherman, "but a moment ago you were one of the greatest of all genies, and now you are one of the least. Your crafty discourse will signify nothing. To the sea you must return, and there you shall stay until the day of judgment. You rejected my prayers, and now I reject yours, and am resolved to throw you into the sea." "My good friend," replied the genie, "do not be guilty of such cruelty. If you will let me out, I promise to do you no hurt. Nay, far from that, I will show you a way to become exceedingly rich." The hope of delivering himself from poverty prevailed with the fisherman, and after making the genie take a great and solemn oath that he would not harm him, he took the covering off the vessel. In an instant, the genie began to resume his form. No sooner had he done so than he kicked the bottle into the sea, laughed at the fisherman's alarmed face, and bade him to follow him, bringing his nets with him. The fisherman took up his nets and followed him with some distrust. They passed by the town and came to the top of a mountain, from whence they descended into a vast plain, which brought them to a lake that lay between 4 hills. When they reached the side of the lake, the genie said to the fisherman, "Cast in your nets and catch fish." The fisherman did so, never doubting that he would make a good catch, for he could see that the waters were full of fish, and to his surprise, they were of 4 colors: white, red, blue, and yellow. He threw in his nets and brought out one of each color. Having never seen the like before, he could not but admire them, and, judging that he might get a considerable sum for them, he was very joyful. "Carry the fish to your sultan," said the genie, "and he will pay you well for them. You may come every day to fish in this lake, but I give you warning not to throw your nets above once a day, otherwise you will repent." Having spoken this, he struck his foot upon the ground, which opened, swallowed him up, and then closed again. The fisherman, following the advice of the genie, did not cast in his nets a second time, but returned to the town and went immediately to the Sultan's palace to offer his fish. The Sultan was much surprised when he saw them, and took them up and examined them closely. "Take them," said he to his vizier, "and carry them to the cook whom the Emperor of the Greeks has sent me. I make no doubt they will prove as good to the taste as to the sight." The vizier carried them as he was directed, and, delivering them to the cook, said, "Here are 4 fish which the Sultan wishes you to dress." He then returned to his master, who ordered him to give the fisherman 400 pieces of gold, which he accordingly did. The fisherman, who had never seen so much money, could scarcely believe his good fortune, but thought the whole must be a dream, until he found it otherwise, by being able to provide necessaries for his family with the produce of his fish. Now as soon as the Sultan's cook received the fish, she prepared them and put them upon the fire in a frying pan with oil, and when she thought them fried enough on one side, she turned them upon the other, but scarcely were they turned when the wall of the kitchen divided, and a young lady of wonderful beauty entered from the opening. She was clad in satin, after the Egyptian manner, with pendants in her ear, a necklace of large pearls, and bracelets of gold set with rubies, and carried a rod in her hand. She moved towards the frying pan, to the great amazement of the cook, and striking one of the fish with the end of the rod, said, "Fish, fish, are you faithful?" Then the 4 fish lifted up their heads and replied, "Yes, yes, if you reckon, we reckon. If you pay your debts, we pay ours." As soon as they had finished these words, the lady overturned the frying pan and returned into the open part of the wall, which closed immediately and became as it was before. The cook was greatly frightened at what had happened, but as soon as she had sufficiently recovered, She took up the fish that had fallen upon the hearth, but they were as black as coal, and not fit to be carried to the Sultan. This troubled her greatly, and she fell to weeping. "Alas," said she, "what will become of me? If I tell the Sultan what I have seen, I am sure he will not believe me, but will be enraged against me." While she was thus bewailing herself, the Grand Vizier entered and asked her if the fish were ready. She told him all that had occurred, and the Vizier sent word to the fisherman to bring 4 more such fish, as a misfortune had befallen the others, so that they were not fit to be carried to the Sultan. The fisherman, without saying anything of what the genie had told him, excused himself for that day on account of the long distance he had to traverse to reach the lake where he caught them, but he promised to bring them without fail on the morrow. Accordingly, he went away by night, and coming to the lake, threw in his nets betimes next morning, took 4 fish like the former, and brought them to the Vizier at the hour appointed. The minister took them and carried them to the kitchen, and shut himself up with the cook, whilst she prepared them and put them on the fire, as she had done the 4 others the day previously. When they were fried on one side, and she had turned them upon the other, the kitchen wall again opened, and the same lady came in with a rod in her hand, struck one of the fish, spoke to it as before, and all 4 gave her the same answer. She then overturned the frying pan with her rod and disappeared through the opening in the wall. The Grand Vizier, having witnessed all that had passed, said that it was too wonderful and extraordinary to be concealed from the Sultan, and that he would inform him therewith. This he did, and the Sultan, being much surprised, sent immediately for the fisherman and said to him, "Friend, bring me 4 more such fish." The fisherman, having undertaken to do so, went immediately to the lake, and at the first throwing in of his net, he caught 4 fish, and brought them immediately to the Sultan, who ordered that 400 pieces of gold should be given him. As soon as the Sultan had the fish, he ordered them to be carried into his private room, with all that was necessary for frying them, and having shut himself up with a Vizier, that minister prepared them and put them into the frying pan, and when they were fried on the one side, turned them upon the other. Then the wall opened, but instead of a young lady, there came out a black, in the habit of a slave, and of gigantic stature, with a great green staff in his hand. He addressed them in the same words the young lady had used, and they answered as before, whereupon the slave overturned the pan, and the fish became black as coals. Having done this, he disappeared through the opening in the wall. "After what I have seen," said the Sultan, "I shall not be able to rest until I know what all this means." He therefore sent for the fisherman, and asked him where he had caught the fish he had brought to the palace. "I fished for them in a lake, situated between 4 hills," he answered. "Beyond the mountains we see from hence." The Sultan then asked the Vizier if he knew of such a lake. "No," replied the Vizier, "I never so much as heard of it, although I have hunted beyond the mountains for over 60 years. The Sultan asked the fisherman how far the lake might be from the palace, and the fisherman, having answered that it was not more than 3 hours' journey, the Sultan ordered all his court to take horse, and commanded the fisherman to serve them as a guide. They all ascended the mountain, and at the foot of it they saw, to their great surprise, a vast plain that nobody had observed till then, and at last they came to the lake, which they found to be situated between 4 hills as the fisherman had described. The water was so transparent that they could see the fish swimming about, and noticed that they were like those the fisherman had brought to the palace. The Sultan then addressed his court and informed them that he had determined not to return to his palace until he had learned how the lake came to be in that place and why all the fish in it were of different colors. Having spoken this, he ordered his court to encamp, and immediately his pavilion and the tents of his household were planted upon the banks of the lake. When night came, the Sultan retired with his Grand Vizier, and at once made known his plans to him. "I intend," said he, "to withdraw myself from the camp, but I wish you to keep my absence a secret. Stay in my pavilion, and tomorrow morning, when the emirs and the courtiers come to attend my levee, tell them that I am ill and wish to be alone. And the following days, tell them the same thing till I return. In the meantime, I intend satisfying myself as to the cause of the strange occurrences we have witnessed." In vain the Grand Vizier endeavored to divert the Sultan from this design, representing to him the dangers to which he might be exposed, but the Sultan was resolved. He put on a suit of clothing suitable for walking, took his scimitar, and as soon as he found that all was quiet in the camp, went out alone and climbed to the top of the hills, without much difficulty. He found the descent still more easy, and when he came to the plain, walked on until the sun arose, and then, at a considerable distance before him, he saw a vast building. As he drew nearer, he found it was a magnificent palace of black polished marble, covered with fine steel, as smooth as glass. He advanced towards the gates, one of which was open, yet he thought it best to knock before entering. This he did, at first softly, but no one appearing, he knocked again and again, always louder and louder. But no one came in answer to his summons, so he decided to enter. "If there be no one in it," said he to himself, "I have nothing to fear, and if it be inhabited, I have wherewith to defend myself." So entering boldly, he cried, "Is there no one here to receive a stranger who comes for refreshment as he passes by?" The dead silence which followed his words increased his astonishment, and so, passing on his way, he came into a spacious court. There was no one to be seen, and he accordingly entered the grand halls, which were hung with silk tapestry. The alcoves and sofas were covered with stuffs of Mecca, and the porches with the richest stuff of India, mixed with gold and silver. Next he came into a superb saloon, in the middle of which was a fountain, with a lion of massy gold at each angle. Water issued from the mouths of the 4 lions, and, as it fell, formed diamonds and pearls. The palace was surrounded on 3 sides by gardens containing the most exquisite flowers, and to complete the beauty of the place, an infinite number of birds filled the air with their harmonious notes. The Sultan walked from apartment to apartment, where he found everything rich and magnificent. Suddenly he heard a voice raised in lamentable tones, and, listening with attention, distinguished these words: "O Fortune, thou who wouldst not suffer me longer to enjoy a happy lot, forbear to persecute me, and by a speedy death put an end to my sorrows. Alas! Is it possible that I am still alive, after so many torments I have suffered?" The Sultan advanced towards the place whence the tones proceeded, and, coming to the door of a great hall, opened it, and saw a handsome young man of a melancholy countenance, richly habited, seated on a throne raised a little above the ground. The Sultan drew near and saluted him, whereupon the young man returned the salutation by an inclination of his head, and, without rising, at the same time he said, "My lord, I am prevented by sad necessity from rising to receive you." "As to the reason of your not rising, whatever your apology be, I heartily accept it," replied the Sultan. "Being drawn hither by your complaints, I come to offer you my help. Perhaps you will relate to me the history of your misfortunes, but inform me first, I pray you, the meaning of the lake near the palace, where the fish are of 4 colors? Whose is this castle? How came you to be here? And why are you alone?" Instead of answering these questions, the young man began to weep bitterly. And upon the Sultan praying to him to relate the cause of his excessive grief, he said, "Alas, my lord, how is it possible but I should grieve?" At these words he lifted up his robe and showed the Sultan that he was a man only from the head to the girdle, and that the other half of his body was black marble. "You must know, my lord," he continued, "that my father, named Mahmud, was king of this country. This is the kingdom of the Black Isles, which takes its name from the 4 small neighboring mountains, for those mountains were formerly islands. The capital where the king, my father, resided was situated on the spot now occupied by the lake you have seen. When my father died, I succeeded him and immediately afterwards married my cousin. I was most tenderly attached to her, and at first believed that my affection was returned. But one day, after we had been married 5 years, I overheard 2 of my wife's ladies conversing together when they believed me to be asleep. One of them said to the other, 'Is the queen not wrong that she does not love so amiable a prince? Every night she mixes the juice of a certain herb with his drink, and this makes him sleep so soundly that she is able to rise and leave him, and visit a black slave who instructs her in magic and all manner of wickedness that she will one day, no doubt, use to the harm of our good lord and master.' You may guess, my lord, how much I was surprised at this conversation, but I feigned to awake without having heard a word. That night I supped with the queen, and when she presented me with a cup of liquid such as I was accustomed to drink, I went to a window which was open and threw out the drink so quickly that she had no knowledge of what I had done. Soon afterwards I lay down, and she, believing me to be asleep, said loud enough for me to hear, 'Sleep on, and may you never wake again.' She then dressed herself and went out of the room. I robed myself in haste, took my scimitar, and followed her so quickly that I soon heard the sound of her feet before me. She passed through several gates, which opened up upon her, pronouncing some magical words, and the last she opened was that of the garden, which she entered. Passing through the garden, she entered a little wood, where she was joined by an enormous black man. Listening intently, I heard them discuss the magical means by which my kingdom, castle, and subjects were to be ruined and overthrown, whilst I myself was to be made away with. I waited until the wicked pair passed by the spot where I had hidden myself, and then struck the slave with a terrific blow with my scimitar. The queen I spared, because she was my kinswoman. I then retired speedily without having made myself known. The wound I had given the slave was mortal, but by her enchantments she preserved him in an existence in which he could not be said to be either dead or alive. As for me, I returned to my bed well satisfied, and when I had rested some hours, I arose as usual, dressed myself, and afterwards held my council. When the queen next presented herself to me, she was clad in deep mourning. I inquired of her the reason, and she informed me that she had 3 distressing causes of affliction. "I have just received news of the death of my mother," said she. "My father had been killed in battle, and my brother has fallen down a precipice." I concluded from her making this excuse for her mourning that she had not suspected me of being the author of the black slave's misfortune, and offered her my sympathy and condolences in her grief. She asked leave to build for herself a palace of tears in which she would shut herself up and weep for those she had lost. I consented to this, and when the building was complete, she caused the black slave to be carried there, and used every art in her power to restore him to life. But though, by her enchantments, she succeeded in preventing his actual death, she could not restore to him the power of speech, neither was he able to walk or support himself. Every day the queen paid him 2 long visits, and worked her magic arts upon him, but without avail. One day my curiosity induced me to follow her to the Palace of Tears, and, having witnessed the tears she shed over the body of the wicked wretch upon whom only just punishment had fallen, I lost patience and discovered myself to her, telling her that such sorrow for a base and ungrateful slave was both dishonoring to her and myself. The queen rose up in a fury and accused me of being the cause of the misery which had overtaken the black magician. Yes, I replied. It was I indeed who chastised him, for I overheard him plotting the downfall of my kingdom. I ought to have treated you in like manner, but spared you because you were my kinswoman. However, I have stayed my hand too long, and I will now make an end of you both. I raised my scimitar to strike, but she quickly pronounced some words I did not understand, and my arm became immovable. Then, raising her voice, she cried jeeringly, "By virtue of my enchantments, I command thee to become half marble and half man." Immediately, my lord, I became what you see, a dead man among the living, and a living man among the dead. After this, the cruel sorceress, unworthy of the name of queen, had changed me thus, and brought me into this hall. By another enchantment, she destroyed my capital, which was very flourishing and populous, changing it into the desert plain and lonely lake which you have seen. The fishes in the lake of 4 different colors are the 4 kinds of inhabitants of different religions which the city contained. The white are the Mussulmen, the red the Persians, who worship fire, the blue the Christians, and the yellow the Jews. The enchantress herself told me all this that she might add to my affliction. But this is not all. Every day, taking advantage of my helpless state, she comes and gives me, upon my naked shoulders, 100 lashes with a whip. When she has finished, she throws over me a coarse gown of goat's hair, and over that this robe of brocade, not to honor but to mock me. The Sultan was greatly moved by the recital of this affecting story, and, anxious to avenge the sufferings of the unfortunate prince, questioned him as to where he might find the wounded magician and the wicked queen. The prince, having informed him of the place in which the Palace of Tears was situated, added that every day at sunrise the queen visited her fellow conspirator and carried to him the potion which had hitherto prevented his dying. Although he had never yet been able to regain the power of speech, so that he might thank her for her attention to him. By this time, the night being far advanced, the Sultan retired to rest. He arose with the dawn and proceeded to the Palace of Tears. Entering, he soon perceived the bed upon which the black magician lay, and with one stroke from his scimitar deprived him of his wretched existence, dragged his body into the court of the castle, and threw it into a well. After this, he went and lay down in the bed, covering his face in such a manner that the queen could not detect the deception about to be practiced upon her. Before long, she entered the apartment, and at the sight of the prostrate figure, she began to weep. "Alas," she said, "will you always be silent? Speak one word to me at least, I conjure you." "Unhappy woman," replied the Sultan in hollow tones, and counterfeiting the pronunciation of the slaves, "art thou worthy that I should answer thee? The cries and groans of thy husband, whom thou treatest every day with such barbarity, prevent my sleeping night or day. Had you disenchanted him, I should long since have been cured, and have recovered the use of my speech." "Well," said the enchantress, "what would you have me do?" "Make haste and set him at liberty, that I may be no longer disturbed by his lamentations," replied the Sultan. The enchantress immediately left the Palace of Tears, and, taking a cup of water, she pronounced some words over it which caused it to boil as if it had been set over a fire. She afterwards proceeded to the young king, her husband, and threw the water upon him, saying, "Resume your natural form." Scarcely had she spoken the words than the king found himself restored to his former condition. The enchantress then returned to the Palace of Tears, and, supposing she still spoke to the slave, informed the Sultan of what she had done. "What you have done is by no means sufficient," replied the Sultan. "The town and its inhabitants still remain enchanted, and every night, at midnight, the fish raise their heads out of the lake and cry for vengeance against you and me. This is the true cause of the delay of my cure. Go speedily and restore things to their former state, and at your return I will give you my hand, and you shall help me to rise." The queen went away at once, and when she came to the brink of the lake, she took a little water in her hand and sprinkled the waters of the lake. Immediately the whole city was restored to its former magnificence, and Mohammedans, Christians, Persians, and Jews, freemen or slaves, were as they were before, everyone having recovered their natural form. The Sultan's numerous retinue found themselves encamped in the middle of a large, handsome, well-peopled city. As soon as the enchantress had effected this wonderful change, she hastened to return to the Palace of Tears. "I have done all that you required of me," she cried. "I pray you then give me your hand and rise." "Come near," said the Sultan, still counterfeiting the pronunciation of the slaves. And as he did so, he suddenly rose, seized her by the arm, and with one blow of his scimitar ended her wicked life. This done, he left her lying in the Palace of Tears, and went to seek for the young king of the Black Isles. When he found him, the prince at once embraced him with great affection, and thanked him with the greatest sincerity for all that he had done for him. The Sultan returned his embraces and said to him, "You may henceforward dwell peaceably in your capital, unless you will accompany me to mine, which is but a few hours' journey distant." "Potent monarch, to whom I owe so much," replied the young king, "it will take you a whole year to return to your capital. I do indeed believe that you came hither in the time you mention because my kingdom was enchanted, but since the enchantment is taken off, things are changed. However, this shall not prevent my following you, were it to the utmost corners of the earth. You are my deliverer, and that I may give you proofs of my acknowledging this during my whole life. I am willing to accompany you, and to leave my kingdom without regret." The Sultan was very much surprised to find he was so far from his own dominions, but answered the young king in the following words: "The trouble of returning to my own country is sufficiently recompensed by acquiring you for a son, for since you will do me the honor to accompany me, as I have no child, I look upon you as such, and from this moment appoint you my heir and successor." Preparations were at once begun for the departure, the young king appointing one of his nearest of kin to reign as monarch in his stead, and, after taking affectionate leave of his subjects, he and the Sultan began their journey. They took with them 100 camels, laden with inestimable riches from the king's treasury, and were followed by 50 handsome gentlemen on horseback, perfectly well mounted and dressed. They had a pleasant journey, and when they approached the capital, the principal officers came to receive the Sultan, and to assure him that his long absence had occasioned no alteration in his empire. The inhabitants also came out in great crowds, received him with acclamations, and made public rejoicings for several days. The Sultan then acquainted his subjects with the news of his having adopted the King of the Black Isles as his son, and told them how he had been willing to leave a great kingdom to accompany and live with him. As for the fisherman, as he was the first cause of the deliverance of the young prince, the Sultan gave him a plentiful fortune, which made him and his family happy for the rest of their days. The end. I hope you enjoyed this tale and stay tuned for another one tomorrow. Do consider subscribing to enjoy many more stories. It's free and would really help me out. Thanks in advance for all your support and see you next time.